3 very unsettling, mysterious creatures horror stories. The night was unnervingly quiet. Too quiet. I had always felt a sense of unease driving alone at night, but this felt different. The road stretched out in front of me, lonely and dark, with only my headlights cutting through the thick fog. It was the kind of fog that made everything feel suffocated, as if the world itself was holding its breath. I wasn't sure why I agreed to come. My uncle had passed away, and the house, old and decrepit, was now mine. But the memories it held, memories of my childhood visits, did nothing but stir unease in me. The farmhouse had always been an eerie place, the kind of house that seemed to breathe with its own heartbeat, the sort of place the neighborhood kids dared one another to explore, but never went far enough. I pulled onto the narrow gravel drive, the wheels of my car crunching beneath the tires. The house loomed ahead, shrouded in a haze. It was bigger than I remembered, its sagging porch barely illuminated by a single flickering light. The trees around it, those twisted, gnarled trees, seemed to stretch toward me, their branches clawing at the sky like they were reaching for something. Or someone. I shivered despite myself. I parked the car, my hands shaking slightly as I gripped the wheel. My stomach was tight, a knot that refused to loosen. There was something wrong about this place. Something I couldn't quite put my finger on. Taking a deep breath, I forced myself out of the car. The cold hit me immediately. The kind of cold that sinks into your bones and doesn't let go. The air was thick, unnaturally still. No wind, no sounds, no movement. Just silence. Heavy, oppressive silence. I could not remember a time when the night had been this quiet. It felt suffocating, like the world was waiting. I took a step toward the house, but my feet felt like they were dragging, reluctant to move. Something was pulling at me, some deep instinct, telling me to turn around, to leave, to run. But I ignored it. I had to be strong. I was here for a reason. The front door creaked open before I even touched it, as though it had been expecting me. A chill ran down my spine. Inside, everything was as I remembered. Dusty, old furniture covered with white sheets, faded portraits of family members that had long since passed. The smell of mothballs and decay clung to the air. It was a house frozen in time, but there was something else, a presence, something I could not see but could feel, pressing against me. The silence inside the house felt wrong. It felt like it was watching me, waiting. I stood there in the middle of the foyer and listened. The house creaked, its floorboards groaning as if it were alive. A slow, deliberate noise echoed from somewhere deep within the house. My breath caught in my throat. It was faint, too faint to be real, but I knew what I had heard. Footsteps. My heart thudded painfully in my chest. I couldn't be imagining it. I wasn't alone. Hello? My voice sounded small, fragile, even to me. The sound of my own voice was almost foreign in the vast silence of the house. I waited for a response, but none came. The air hung still, heavy, waiting. I forced myself to move forward, walking cautiously toward the stairs. The old wooden steps creaked under my feet, each one seeming to echo louder than the last. The hallway above stretched out like a dark tunnel, the shadows swallowing everything. I couldn't stop myself from glancing over my shoulder. I had to be sure. Nothing but the feeling. The sensation that something was there lingered. It was as though the house had eyes that watched my every movement. My uncle's room was just down the hall. I needed to go in. I needed to find whatever it was I was supposed to be looking for. I had to keep moving forward, no matter how much my instincts screamed for me to turn back. As I stood in front of the door to his room, I hesitated. My hand hovered over the doorknob, trembling slightly. The silence had become unbearable, suffocating. I felt like I was being drawn into something dark, something ancient. I opened the door. The room was just as it had always been. The same dusty furniture, the same old photographs, the same thick curtains drawn tightly across the windows. But the air in here was different, thicker, colder. My breath misted in front of me, though I was standing right under the heat vent. And then I heard it, a sound, soft, almost imperceptible, like something dragging itself across the floor. I froze. My pulse spiked. It was too close. It was behind me. I spun around. Nothing, just the room. Silent. Still. I could hear my own breathing now. Shallow, rapid, as I tried to force calmness into my chest. It's nothing. I whispered to myself, my voice trembling. It's just the house. It's just old. But the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I could feel it. Something was in the room with me, watching me. The air felt heavier, more suffocating. I moved to the window, thinking I might look outside to clear my head, but when I caught a glimpse of something in the reflection, my stomach dropped. A figure, a tall shadow standing just outside the window. I turned quickly, my pulse was a drumbeat in my ears. The figure was gone, but I could still feel its presence, like it was lingering just beyond the edge of my vision. I wanted to run, but my legs felt rooted to the spot. I couldn't tear my gaze away from the window. Something was out there. I needed to leave, but just as I reached for the door, I heard it again. The dragging sound. Closer this time, coming from the hallway, slow, relentless. I rushed to the door and flung it open. The hallway was empty. But then I heard something else. Breathing. Slow, deliberate breaths, and it wasn't mine. I backed away. My heart raced as I spun toward the stairs, running down them as fast as I could. The air seemed to thicken around me, every shadow growing more menacing, every sound amplified. I reached the front door, my hand shaking as I fumbled for the doorknob. I threw it open, gasping for air. The cold night greeted me, but it felt like a relief, as if I had been drowning and had just surfaced for the first breath. But when I turned to look back, I saw it. There, just beyond the threshold, standing at the edge of the porch, was a figure. Tall, towering, its limbs twisted in impossible angles, and its face was hidden in shadow, but I could feel its eyes. Its gaze pierced through me like cold steel. I did not wait. I ran. I ran until my legs burned and my chest ached, not daring to look back. I did not stop. When I finally reached the car, I slammed the door behind me. My breath came in sharp gasps. I looked at the farmhouse one last time, the light flickering in the distance. I could see the shape now. It was standing in the window, watching, waiting, and I knew. The watchers were still there, in the woods, always waiting. I would never return. This is very scariest. Mysterious Creatures, Horror Story number 2. The fog was thick as Liliana's car slowly rolled into the forgotten town of Riverbend, the kind of place you don't expect to find on any map. The GPS had long since stopped working, and the road signs had faded away, leaving her unsure of where she was headed. And then, out of nowhere, Riverbend appeared. It was wrong. The fog hung heavily in the air, an unnatural, almost suffocating presence that seemed to swallow everything around her. The dim lights of the town flickered weakly, casting long, distorted shadows against buildings that seemed more like empty husks than homes. There was something deeply unsettling about the place. She told herself it was nothing, just a small, quiet town. But the silence was the first thing that struck her. No dogs barking, no sounds of footsteps, nothing, only the thick, damp air pressing against her skin. Liliana pulled over and parked her car, gripping the steering wheel a little tighter than she meant to. She hesitated. She should have just kept driving, turned around and never looked back. But her exhaustion pushed her to move forward. She needed a place to stay. A flicker of light caught her eye. An old, weathered inn stood at the end of the road. She could barely make out the faded sign hanging above the door, but it was enough. It was her only option. With a deep, steadying breath, Liliana stepped out of the car and into the cool night air. Her boots crunched on the gravel as she walked toward the entrance, her eyes scanning the area. Was it her imagination, or did the shadows seem deeper here? The buildings on either side seemed to lean in, almost as if they were watching her, waiting for her to step into the unknown. When she pushed open the door to the inn, the heavy smell of dust and wood filled her senses. It was old, abandoned almost. The creaking of the floorboards echoed in the silence. The innkeeper's desk stood to the left, but no one was behind it.
The dim lighting made the room feel more like a forgotten memory than a place people had visited recently. "Hello," Leliana called out, her voice trembling slightly, though she did not understand why. She cleared her throat and tried again, louder this time. "Hello?" Just as she was about to turn away, a figure emerged from the back, a woman. She was tall, unnaturally thin, and her pale face seemed to have been carved from stone. She had the look of someone who had not seen sunlight in ages. Her eyes, however, those eyes, they were wide, too wide, and they seemed to peer right through Leliana, as if searching for something in her very soul. I need a room for the night," Leliana said, struggling to keep her voice steady. She tried to ignore the unnerving stillness of the woman, the eerie way she just stared at her. "Do you have anything available?" The woman did not respond immediately. Instead, her gaze seemed to linger just a second too long. It was unnerving, like the weight of it was pressing into Leliana's chest. And then finally, the woman moved. She handed over a key, the metal clinking in her pale fingers. Her lips parted, and she spoke softly, almost whispering, as if the words were too heavy to be heard. "Stay inside tonight," the woman said. "The fog. It thickens at night. It's dangerous out there. You should stay." The woman's voice seemed so quiet, almost knowing, but Leliana brushed it off as odd, though not entirely unfounded. She thanked the woman, trying to ignore the knot forming in her stomach. The hallway upstairs was even darker. The walls were old, stained with time, but Leliana paid little attention to that. She just needed sleep. She was tired from the long drive, from the suffocating silence that clung to Riverbend. "Room 3, the sign said. She unlocked the door with trembling hands, stepping inside. Everything was as expected. A small bed, a wardrobe in the corner, a faded floral quilt covering the mattress. She quickly dropped her things onto the bed, hoping the familiar comfort of a room would give her a sense of relief. But the unease remained. She closed the window, and the fog outside pressed closer, now thicker than ever. She couldn't see anything beyond the glass except shadows. Movement, but nothing clear enough to make sense of it. Leliana blinked. Was she imagining things? Something moved again. There, on the edge of her vision. A flicker. A dark shape. She froze, straining her eyes, trying to make sense of it. Was it someone or something? Her breath quickened. She pushed the thought out of her mind. She was just tired. That was all. She needed sleep, but sleep did not come. She lay there in the dark, listening to the faint, unsettling sounds of the night. The creaking of the building, the rustle of wind against the walls, the whisper of something else. It was a soft sound at first, so quiet that she thought she had imagined it. But then, help! The word came from outside, a woman's voice, soft and filled with distress. It was muffled, as though it had been carried on the fog. Help! Leliana froze in her bed, her heart skipping a beat. No one else is here. She rose quickly, walking toward the window and pushing it open, letting the cold air rush inside. The fog swirled in front of her, thick, oppressive. She peered into it, into the shadows beyond, but saw nothing. Her mind raced. The voice, it had sounded desperate, and then, there it was again. Help! Leliana could not shake the feeling that she was being drawn into something dark. A part of her wanted to ignore it, pretend it was nothing, but another part of her, the part deep inside, knew that something was wrong. Without thinking, she grabbed her jacket, pulling it tightly around her. She stepped into the hallway, which was as empty and quiet as before. She was alone. Wasn't she? She stepped carefully down the stairs, and then the sound of the door creaking caught her attention. The door to the outside was wide open. A chill swept through her body, and before she could even question it, her feet were moving toward the door. Something inside her told her she needed to go out, needed to find out what was happening. But as soon as she stepped outside, the mist seemed to close in, the air thick with a weight she could not explain. It felt wrong. She felt wrong. Then she heard it. "Help!" It was closer now, and then she saw them. Eyes, glowing in the fog, 2 eyes, staring at her from the mist. Her heart pounded against her ribs. Her hands trembled at her sides. She wanted to scream, but her voice was trapped in her throat. And then, they started moving. Shapes, tall and thin, shifting from the fog. Their movements were jerky, unnatural, like they were somehow not alive. Liliana took a step back, but the door to the inn slammed shut behind her with a force that made her jump. She was trapped. The eyes moved closer, the shapes growing more distinct. They were tall, too tall, and their eyes gleamed like silver orbs, unblinking, watching her. Her breath came in sharp gasps now. The fog swallowed her whole. She was not alone anymore. This is very creepy. Mysterious Creatures Horror Story number 3. Lila had spent 2 years in the small town of Armitage, and yet she still felt like an outsider. There was something unsettling about the place. The people? Friendly enough. But there was an unspoken distance, a sense of something strange that lingered in the air. Maybe it was the silence of the town, the way time seemed to slow down and drag on. Maybe it was the shadows that stretched across the town, no matter the time of day. But above all, it was the woods, the forest just beyond the edge of town. The trees were dense, casting long shadows, even during the daylight. The locals, most of whom had lived there their entire lives, always spoke of it with a kind of nervous reverence. They would tell stories, tales whispered under breath, about things in the forest, things that should not be there. They told Lila not to go there, not after dark. But tonight, something felt different. Lila had just finished her shift at the local cafe, walking home along the quiet streets. The night was colder than usual, the wind sharp, biting at her skin. She had just crossed the small bridge that marked the edge of town when she heard it. A voice. At first it seemed like the wind, a soft, distant murmur that could have been anything. But then it came again, louder, clearer. "Help me!" The words were unmistakable. It was a voice pleading, desperate. Lila froze. Her heart skipped a beat. She looked down the narrow path that led into the forest. The trees were dark and looming, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch out toward her. Her breath caught in her throat, and she felt that familiar chill race down her spine. "Help me!" The voice called again, louder this time, almost closer. It was unmistakable. Someone was out there. Someone needed help. And yet, something about it felt wrong. The voice didn't sound quite right. It was too soft, too faint. Lila stood there, her feet rooted to the ground. Her heart pounded in her chest. Every instinct screamed at her to turn around, to go back home, to forget that she had even heard it. But somehow she could not. She stepped forward. Slowly at first, then quicker, as if some force beyond her control was pushing her into the woods. She was hesitant, every step feeling heavier, colder. The wind had stopped. The night air had gone still, and the silence was suffocating. With every step, the voice grew clearer. It was coming from deep inside the forest, a soft whisper that tugged at her soul, urging her onward. "Help me!" The path grew darker, tighter. The trees pressed in on all sides, as though they were trying to close in on her. The air smelled thick, like earth and decay, and Lila's steps faltered. Her skin crawled. She should have stopped. She should have turned back. But no, she could not stop. Not now. The voice seemed to guide her deeper into the forest, its tone pleading, desperate, and something else. There was a note of something darker in the voice now, something unnatural. "Please, help me." Lila stopped. Her breath came in shallow gasps, her pulse racing. There, just ahead of her, was a small clearing. In the center of it, an old crumbling stone well. It was ancient, the stones worn down by time, covered with thick layers of moss. It looked forgotten. The voice was coming from there. Lila hesitated. Should she go closer? Should she peer into the well? Something in her screamed at her to run, to turn back before it was too late. But her body did not listen. She walked forward, compelled by some invisible force. Her feet moved closer to the edge of the well, and she bent down, peering inside. It was pitch black. The depths seemed endless, the darkness swallowing up all light. The voice came again. This time, it was louder, closer, right from the well itself. "Help me," it echoed, almost a growl now. Lila jumped back. Her heart thundered in her chest. She looked around, her eyes darting nervously in the dim light. The forest was silent. Too silent. The wind had stopped. The creatures, the animals, everything had gone still. Lila felt it then. The cold, the heavy presence, watching her. She wasn't alone. Her instincts screamed at her to run, but she couldn't. She turned, her breath ragged, as she looked toward the edge of the trees. Her eyes scanned the shadows, and then, there, she saw it. A figure. It was towering, moving in jerky, unnatural steps, its limbs bent at odd angles. It was covered in a shadow, darker than the night itself. Lila's breath caught in her throat. The figure's eyes, those eyes, glowed, faintly, with an eerie light. They locked onto her, piercing, cold, dead. "Help me," it whispered. The voice came from it, from the creature. Lila's legs went weak. She wanted to run, but she could not. She was rooted to the spot, her eyes locked with the creature's. It took a step closer, then another. Its movements were too fast, too jerky, like something that was not quite human. Something that should not have been. The whisper came again. This time, it was not a plea. It was a demand. "Help me!" Lila's heart pounded. She could feel the weight of the creature's stare. It was coming closer, and all she could do was stand there, paralyzed by fear. The thing moved again. Its massive form shifted in the darkness, its limbs twisting unnaturally. Lila took a step back, then another. "Run!" She spun around and bolted. Her feet hit the ground hard, the dirt beneath her slipping and sliding. But she did not stop. She couldn't. Not now. The thing was right behind her. She could feel it. A growl rumbled from deep in the woods, an inhuman, terrifying sound that echoed through the trees. Lila's pulse raced, her breath burning in her chest, but she could not stop. Not until she was out of the forest. When she finally reached the edge of the woods, breathless and shaking, she did not stop to look back. She ran until she burst through the door of her home, slamming it behind her. She collapsed against it, panting. The room was silent, but that voice, that whisper, stayed with her. "Help me." It lingered in her ears. Lila closed her eyes, trying to shake off the terror. She knew it was real. It had been real. The creature was still out there, and it would come for her again.